Hey there guys, welcome to the video. My name is Pushpinder Gill, and in this video we're going to be talking about this video is an introduction to this video is an introduction to the grouped data, right? So we're going to be talking about all the definitions of grouped data. Before we get started, this is our email website address, this is our Facebook page address, and this is our email address where you can give us your valuable feedback. Right, so let's go ahead and get started, guys. Right, so this is how a group data looks like. So there is a quantity, right? It could be length of something or the age of someone, it could be anything, right? So this is what we have, and this is the frequency by which it increases, but so the number of times it occurs. So let's suppose you have 30 to 31, which actually occurs two times. So there are two data sets which are actually between 30 to 31. They can actually take any value between 30 to 31. Then you have 32 till 33, which has a frequency of 25. Let's say we have 34 to 36, which have a frequency of 30, and we have 37 to 39, which have a frequency of 30. Now let's suppose this is our group data, right? So this over here is a group data. I suppose you've understood what is the meaning of frequency and what is the meaning of these values, right? Because that's actually very important. So this means 2 means that this occurs 2 times, 25 means this occurs 25 times, 30 means this occurs 30 times. Now the first thing that we're going to be discussing, the first thing is the classes. Now what do you mean by classes? Now these things are known as classes. So this is a class from 30 to 31, this is a class from 32 to 33, this is a class from 34 to 36, and this is a class from 37 to 39. So these things are known as classes. Then you have something which is known as class boundaries. Now what do you mean by class boundaries? Now class boundaries has two parts. It has a lower boundary and it has an upper boundary. Now let's suppose if I want to talk about the lower boundary and upper boundary for this class, that is from 34 to 36. Now as you can see, there is a gap of between 34 and 36, right? So the gap is with 1 point, that is actually between 34 and 36. The lower class boundary for 34 and 36 will be halfway between 33 and 34, which is actually equal to 33. So the lower class boundary will actually be equal to 33 plus 34 divided by 2, which is equal to 33.5. So the lower boundary for this is 33.5. And what about the upper boundary? Right, so the upper boundary again is actually going to be halfway between 36 and 37, which is actually going to be equal to 36.5, right? So the lower boundary is defined as, so let's suppose if I want to find the lower boundary for a class, let's suppose that class goes from xi till xj, right? So the lower boundary is actually going to be halfway between, so that is xi plus whatever lower boundary you have here. Let's suppose this is xi minus 1 divided by 2, right? And the upper boundary is actually going to be equal to, so the upper boundary is actually going to be equal to xj, which is this, plus whatever going to be the next one, which is xj plus 1, x of j plus 1 divided by 2. So the lower boundary, the upper boundary here is actually going to be equal to 31 plus 32 divided by 2, which is 31.5. Fine. So suppose you're understanding this point over here. The next thing that we're going to define is the class width. So what do you mean by class width? The class width is actually going to be equal to the lower boundary minus the upper boundary, or you can actually say it's the difference between the class boundaries. So it's the positive difference between the class boundaries, right? So that is actually equal to the higher boundary minus the lower boundary. So let's suppose for this case the class width is 36.5 minus 33.5, which is actually equal to 3. Fine. So I suppose you're understanding this point over here, guys. Let's actually see a question here. Let's suppose we talk about a graph here. Let's suppose this is a time to run 100 meters, right, in seconds. So this is given to us as 55 to 65, 65 till 70, 70 till 75, and 75 till 90. And we have the number of children here, right? So that is going to be 2, 25, 30, and 30. So this is our data. Now what do we have to find? We have to find the class, let's suppose we have to find the class boundaries for the class 70 to 75. So the class boundary is actually going to be equal to 70 plus 70 divided by 2, right? Because this is 70, this is also 70. So the class boundary is simply going to be 70 plus 70 divided by 2, which is 70. And here is 75 plus 75 divided by 2, which is equal to 75. So this is the lower class boundary. This is the upper class boundary, right? Let's suppose if we want to find the midpoint. Now there is something which is known as the midpoint. What is midpoint? Midpoint is actually equal to half of lower class boundary plus the upper class boundary. So that is equal to half of the lower class boundary plus the upper class boundary, which is equal to 72.5, right? And another thing would be the class width. Class width is nothing but the upper class boundary minus the lower class boundary, which is equal to 75 minus 70, which is 5. So I suppose you're understanding this point over here, guys. So I'm just going to summarize what I just did, right? So first thing that we did was, what do you mean by classes, right? So if you have any data set, let's suppose if you have 10 to 20, 21 till 29, 30 till 39, let's suppose you have something like this. This is actually known as a class, right? And from the classes you had class boundaries. Class boundaries will actually have two parts. It'll have a lower class boundary and an upper class boundary. So a lower class boundary for here would be 21 plus 20 divided by 2 and 29 plus 30 divided by 2. So it's going to be 20.5 and it's going to be 30.5 for this one, right? So that is the lower class boundary and the upper class boundary. Then you have something known as the midpoint of a class. A midpoint of a class is actually defined as the average of the lower class boundary and the upper class boundary, which means lower class boundary plus upper class boundary divided by 2. And then you have your class width, which is actually equal to the difference between the upper class boundary and the lower class boundary. So this is actually different it's actually calculated different for each class, right? So I suppose you're understanding this point over here, guys. So thank you very much for watching this video. Just make sure that you explore our website, that is perfect-course.com, right? Don't forget to explore this, and you'll be able to watch all our videos. And this would be our Facebook page to give us your valuable like, and this would be our email address to give us your valuable feedback. So thank you very much for watching this video, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.